Emily, the millionaire's little daughter, was failing all her tests until a housekeeper taught her a secret. Subscribe to the channel and comment on where you are watching from. The automatic gate of the mansion in Beverly Hills closed with a metallic sound that echoed down the tree-lined street. Emily got out of the school car, her small feet barely touching the ground, before the driver accelerated toward the next stop. The 8-year-old girl carried her pink backpack as if it were too heavy for her fragile shoulders, her messy brown hair sticking to her sweaty face from anxiety. The house before her was a work of modern architecture, all glass and exposed concrete, with geometrically perfect gardens that looked like they came straight out of a home decor magazine. 3 stories of pure luxury, an infinity pool, and a garage that housed a Tesla, an Audi, and the Ferrari that her father, Dr. Richard Anderson, drove on weekends. Everything was immaculate, cold, and silent like a mausoleum. Emily took a deep breath before ringing the doorbell. She knew that Karen, the housekeeper, would open the door with that forced smile and ask about school in a polite manner. Then would come the part she feared the most, showing her report card. "Good afternoon, Emily," said Karen, a middle-aged woman with an always impeccable uniform. "How was school today?" The girl merely nodded, avoiding the housekeeper's gaze. Her ballet flats made a muffled sound on the Carrara marble floor as she walked through the entrance hall, where a Czech crystal chandelier hung over a coffee table adorned with floral arrangements that were changed twice a week. "Your father is in his office," Karen informed. "He wants to talk to you." Emily's stomach tightened. Dr. Richard Anderson was an imposing man. With his well-preserved 45 years, grey hair slicked back, and tailored suits that cost more than the annual salary of many families. A specialist in tax law, he defended large corporations and had an unbeatable reputation in the higher courts. However, at home, this eloquence transformed into heavy silences and sighs of disappointment. Emily knocked on the office door, a space lined with fine wood where shelves filled with legal codes reached the ceiling. Behind the executive desk, her father typed furiously on his laptop, his glasses reflecting the light from the screen. "Come in," he said without looking up. The girl approached slowly, her backpack still hanging on her shoulders. On the desk, she could see piles of case files, a half-empty coffee cup, and a phone that kept vibrating with messages from the office. The report card. He extended his hand without looking at her. Emily opened the zipper of her backpack with trembling fingers and took out the folded paper. It was always the same. Red zeros in math, English, and science. Sometimes she managed to get 2s or 3s in physical education or arts, but never enough to please. Dr. Richard finally raised his eyes, and Emily saw that expression she knew all too well, a mix of frustration, shame, and incomprehension. He unfolded the report card and quickly scanned the numbers. "Emily, I don't understand." His voice was low, controlled, but heavy with disappointment. "You have the best private tutors in Los Angeles. You attend the most prestigious school in the city. You have every possible resource." The girl fixed her gaze on the polished wooden floor, mentally counting the planks to try to control the tears that threatened to spill. "Look at me when I'm talking," he said, removing his glasses and rubbing his temples. Emily raised her eyes and found her father's tired face. Even as a successful man, the wrinkles around his eyes betrayed sleepless nights, constant stress, and the weight of responsibilities. "Do you know how much I invest in your education? How hard I work to give you the best opportunities?" "I know, Dad," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "Then why do you keep getting these grades? What's going on in your head?" It was a question Dr. Richard asked frequently, always expecting an answer that never came. Emily didn't know how to explain why the letters danced in front of her when she tried to read, why the numbers seemed to jumble in her mind, why she felt so lost in class, while the other students seemed to understand everything with ease. "I try, Dad. I swear I try." "Trying is not enough, Emily. Results are what matter." He stood up from his chair and walked to the window overlooking the garden. Outside, the gardener was trimming the rose bushes with surgical precision, each movement calculated to maintain the aesthetic perfection of the environment. "I'm going to hire another tutor," he said, still facing away. "Dr. Smith recommended. An educator who works with children with learning differences." The word differences left his mouth with a weight that made Emily shrink even more. She knew her father wasn't referring to the good kind of special. "Now go to your room and do your homework. Karen will bring dinner up there." Emily left the office with heavy steps, climbing the marble staircase that led to the second floor. Her room was huge, decorated in shades of pink and white, with a bed that could accommodate 3 children and toys, organized on shelves that looked like a department store. She threw herself onto the bed, still in her school uniform, and looked at the ceiling where glow-in-the-dark stars formed constellations her father had installed for her 7th birthday. It was beautiful, but artificial, like everything in that house. From the garden came the sounds of the city, distant honks, a dog's bark, the sound of music coming from the neighboring house. Emily closed her eyes and tried to imagine what it would be like to live in a house filled with laughter, conversations at the dinner table, and someone asking about her feelings instead of her grades. Her father's phone rang downstairs, and she heard his voice answering, "Richard Anderson." Always formal, always busy, always distant. It had been this way since her mother passed away 3 years ago, a victim of a cancer that consumed not only her life, but also the joy of that house. Emily opened her backpack and spread her notebooks across the bed. Math, English, science, each subject was an indecipherable mystery. She picked up her pencil and tried to start the math exercises, but the numbers seemed to dance on the page, forming a confusing ballet that made her head ache. Downstairs she heard the front door open and Patricia's high heels echoing through the hall. Her stepmother had returned from the gym, probably followed by another session at the salon. Patricia was a 38-year-old woman, platinum blonde, with a body sculpted by plastic surgeries and aesthetic treatments. She had married Richard 2 years ago, bringing into the house an expensive perfume and an even greater coldness. "Richard, darling," her voice floated up the stairs, "I need to talk to you about the club party on Saturday." Emily sighed. The conversations between her father and stepmother always revolved around social events, business trips, and, occasionally, about how the girl was holding back his professional development with her academic struggles. She tried to refocus on her homework, but it was impossible. The words in the English book jumbled together, forming a nonsensical word soup. Frustrated, Emily threw the pencil away and lay on her side, hugging a teddy bear that her mother had given her. In the kitchen, 3 floors below, Mrs. Smith finished organizing the last utensils. It was her first week in the house, and she was still adjusting to the vastness of the place and the coldness of the family relationships. 52-year-old woman, she had left behind a simple life in a small town in Florida to work in the capital, sending almost her entire salary to support her children and help raise her grandchildren. Mrs. Smith had calloused hands from a lifetime of work, grey hair always tied in a simple bun, and brown eyes that radiated the wisdom of someone who had raised 6 children practically alone. She wore the white uniform imposed by her employer, but carried a necklace with a small wooden cross and a lucky charm that her grandmother had given her when she was a child. While seasoning, Mrs. Smith finished seasoning the beans with bay leaves and left the pot on low heat, watching the bubbles lazily rise to the surface. The familiar smell transported her back to her home in rural Florida, where the wood stove perfumed the entire kitchen and her children fought to scrape the bottom of the pot. Here, in the sterile kitchen with black granite and state-of-the-art appliances, everything operated with the precision of a laboratory, but it lacked soul. "Nair!" Patricia's shrill voice echoed through the intercom. "Bring a detox orange juice to the office, and no sugar." "Yes, Mrs. Patricia," she replied, drying her hands on her apron. Mrs. Smith knew that tone of voice well. It was the same one her former employer used in Miami when she treated her more like an object than a person. But she needed this job. Her grandchildren were growing, and her retirement money barely covered food. While blending the juice in the imported blender that cost more than her monthly salary, Mrs. Smith heard footsteps coming down the stairs. They were different from the firm steps of Richard or Patricia's elegant clicking. They were hesitant steps, almost whispered. Emily appeared in the kitchen doorway, still in her school uniform, hair messy and eyes red from crying. The girl looked around as if she didn't know if she could enter, biting her lower lip in a manner that Mrs. Smith immediately recognized. It was exactly how her granddaughter Lily acted when she was nervous. "Hi," Emily said softly, almost a whisper. "Hi, my dear," Mrs. Smith replied, with the naturalness of someone who had spoken to hundreds of children. "Are you hungry? I can make you a snack." The girl shook her head but didn't leave the doorway. She stood there, watching the precise movements of the cook, who sliced oranges into perfect pieces without even needing to look at the knife. "Are you new here?" Emily asked after a few minutes of silence. "I am. My name is Mrs. Smith. But you can call me Mrs. Smith, okay? And you must be Emily." "How do you know?" "Because I saw your pictures on the fridge over there," Mrs. Smith gently lied. In reality, she had asked Karen about the family as soon as she arrived, but she didn't want the girl to feel exposed. Emily finally stepped into the kitchen and sat on one of the high stools next to the central counter. Her feet dangled in the air, not reaching the ground, and she nervously fiddled with her backpack strap. "Why did you come to work here?" The question came out with a genuine curiosity that touched Mrs. Smith's heart. "Because I need to work to support my family back in Florida. I have children and grandchildren who depend on me." "Do you have grandchildren? How old are they?" "I have 5 grandchildren. The youngest is your age, 8 years old. Her name is Lily." For the first time, Emily smiled, a small but genuine smile. "Does she go to school?" "Yes, she does. And did you know she had the same struggles as you?" Emily's smile instantly disappeared, replaced by an expression of alarm. "How do you know about my struggles?" Mrs. Smith stopped slicing the oranges and turned to the girl. There was something in Emily's posture, in the way she averted her gaze, the way they looked when they talked about school, the way their hands trembled when holding the notebooks, painfully reminded her of Lily. "Because I see things, my angel. I see that you are smart, but the school doesn't understand your way of learning." "I'm not smart," Emily murmured, swinging her legs more intensely. "My dad said I'm special." The way she pronounced the word special made Mrs. Smith's heart ache. It was loaded with shame, misunderstanding, the weight of being seen as defective. "You are special, but not in the way they are telling you." At that moment, Patricia appeared in the kitchen doorway, wearing a bright pink workout outfit that cost more than Mrs. Smith's monthly salary. Her blonde hair was tied in a high ponytail, and she carried a water bottle filled with energizing crystals. "Emily, what are you doing here? Your homework won't do itself," she said irritably. "And Mrs. Smith, where's my juice?" "It's ready, Mrs. Patricia," Mrs. Smith replied, straining the juice into a glass pitcher. "Emily, go upstairs now. Your dad can't know you're wasting time down here." The girl quickly hopped off the stool, grabbed her backpack, and left the kitchen without looking back. Mrs. Smith watched her hunched posture, the way she shrank her shoulders as she passed her stepmother, and felt a mix of anger and compassion. Mrs. Smith. Patricia's voice was as cold as ice. I want to make one thing clear. You were hired to cook and keep the house organized, not to befriend the child. Emily's education is our responsibility and that of the teachers we hire. Yes, Mrs. Patricia. Another thing, the girl has learning issues. We don't want her to get even more distracted, so avoid unnecessary conversations. Mrs. Smith nodded, but inside she was boiling. She knew this kind of prejudice well, this need to hide difficulties as if they were defects. She had faced the same thing with Lily, until she discovered that the problem wasn't with the girl, but with how they tried to teach her. After Patricia left with her juice and arrogance, Mrs. Smith went upstairs to organize the rooms. The house had 3 floors. On the ground floor were the living room, kitchen, office, and a guest suite. On the second floor, the master bedroom, a library, and Emily's room. On the third, an unused studio and her room. As she passed by the girls' room, she heard muffled crying. Mrs. Smith stopped in front of the slightly open door and saw Emily sitting on the bed, surrounded by open notebooks, crying over a math exercise. She held the pencil awkwardly, gripping it tightly, and the paper was filled with scribbles. "I can't do it. I can't do it," she repeated softly, rocking back and forth. Mrs. Smith's heart broke. This was exactly how Lily would be when trying to do homework. The same frustration, the same despair, the same feeling of being dumb, when in reality her brain worked differently. She gently knocked on the door. "Emily, can I come in?" The girl quickly wiped her tears. "I can't talk to you. Patricia said I can't get distracted. She's not here. I just want to see if you're okay." Emily hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Mrs. Smith entered the luxurious room, observing the shelves filled with expensive toys that seemed never to have been touched, the clothes organized by color in the closet, the immaculate floor where nothing was out of place. "What's making you sad?" "Math. I don't understand anything, and the tutor is coming tomorrow." Mrs. Smith approached and looked at the notebook. They were simple addition and subtraction problems, but for someone with dyslexia, and she was almost certain that was it. The numbers could look like indecipherable hieroglyphs. "Can I tell you a secret?" she said, sitting on the edge of the bed. Emily looked at her with curiosity. "My granddaughter Lily also cried like that, until we discovered that she learns in a different way. And do you know what happened when we started teaching her the way she learns?" "What?" "She became the best student in her class." For the first time in a long while, Emily smiled genuinely. The following week brought a routine that Mrs. Smith observed with growing attention. Every morning, Dr. Richard left at exactly 6:30, always with the same ritual. Black coffee, folded newspaper under his arm, and a call to the office even before getting into the car. Patricia woke up at 9, went to the gym, then to the salon, and returned in the afternoon with her nails done and hair touched up. And Emily? Emily came home from school every day with the same lost look, carrying her backpack as if it were a cross. Mrs. Smith had developed a silent strategy. Whenever the girl passed through the kitchen, she would leave a plate with something special, a piece of warm cornmeal cake, coconut candy made from her great-grandmother's recipe, or chocolate truffles shaped like numbers. She never said anything, just smiled and continued her tasks, but she watched out of the corner of her eye as Emily took the treat and savored it slowly, as if that were the first sweet moment of her day. On Thursday, while preparing lunch, Mrs. Smith heard Dr. Richard's voice on the phone, louder than usual. "No, Mr. Johnson, I won't accept that excuse. Emily is 8 years old. She's not a baby. If she's not responding to traditional methods, then she's not trying hard enough." Mrs. Smith stopped chopping the vegetables. Through the slightly open kitchen door, she could see the man pacing back and forth in the office, his tie loosened and hair disheveled. "Look, I pay a fortune for these tutoring sessions. I want results, you understand? Results!" He slammed the phone down hard, and Mrs. Smith pretended to be focused on the sauté as he passed through the kitchen on his way to the living room. That afternoon, Emily came home from school looking even more dejected than usual. She had a small bandage on her knee and puffy eyes. Without saying a word, she went straight to the kitchen and sat on the stool, dropping her backpack on the floor with a dull thud. "What happened to your knee, my dear?" Mrs. Smith asked, drying her hands on her apron. "I fell during recess," Emily murmured. "I was running and didn't see the step." Mrs. Smith noticed that the girl was lying. There was something in the way she avoided eye contact, in the tension of her shoulders. But she didn't press. She knew the signs of a child carrying secrets too heavy for her age. "Do you want me to put a new bandage on? I know how to make one that doesn't hurt at all." Emily nodded, and Mrs. Smith went to get the first aid kit. While gently cleaning the wound, she hummed a lullaby that used to calm her children. "Little frog by the river bank, when the frog sings, oh sister, it's because he's cold." To her surprise, Emily completed, "The frog's wife is in there, making lace, oh sister, for your wedding." "You know this song?" "My mum used to sing it to me when I was little," Emily said, her voice dropping. At the end, it was the first time she mentioned her mother. Mrs. Smith finished the bandage in silence, respecting that delicate moment. "Mrs. Smith," Emily said, after a few minutes, "you said your granddaughter learns differently. What do you mean?" Mrs. Smith looked around to make sure they were alone. Patricia had left for another waxing session, and Dr. Richard wouldn't be back before 8. "Come sit here next to me, and I'll explain." Emily moved closer, and Mrs. Smith began to gather ingredients to make chocolate truffles. Lily, my granddaughter, when she started school, she also couldn't understand the numbers on paper. To her, the numbers danced around, moving like little ants. "That's exactly it," exclaimed Emily, her eyes lighting up. "They move. So I started teaching math in a different way. Want to see?" Mrs. Smith put sugar, sweetened condensed milk, and cocoa powder in the pot, stirring slowly as she spoke. "Look, if I have 2 cups of sugar," she showed while measuring, "and I add 1 more cup, how many cups do I have now?" Emily looked at the cups on the counter and counted 3. "That's right, and if I use 1 cup to and make the candy, how many are left?" 2. "Perfect. You just did addition and subtraction. Did you know that?" Emily's face lit up with sudden understanding. "But that's easy." "It is easy when we do it the right way. Now help me stir this truffle mixture." For an hour the two worked side by side. Mrs. Smith taught fractions using the measurements. Half a cup is half of a whole cup. Percentages with the ingredients. If the recipe calls for 100 grams of chocolate and we've already used 50, how much percent is left? And even geography, talking about where cocoa and sugarcane come from. Emily absorbed everything with impressive ease, asking intelligent questions and making connections that showed an agile and creative mind. She was a completely different child from the frustrated girl who had come home from school. "Mrs. Smith," she said while rolling the truffles, "why don't they teach like this at school?" "Because every child learns differently, and sometimes teachers don't know that. But that doesn't mean you're not smart. It means you need a special way to learn. Special good or special bad. Special wonderful, like the birds that fly differently, but they all reach the same place." At that moment they heard the front door open. Patricia had returned early. Quickly, Mrs. Smith put away the ingredients, and Emily grabbed her backpack. "Emily!" Patricia's voice echoed. "Where are you?" "In the kitchen," the girl replied, already fearful in her voice. Patricia appeared in the doorway, wearing a tight white dress that accentuated her artificial tan. Her blue eyes, a product of expensive contact lenses, scanned the kitchen with suspicion. "What are you two doing?" "I was thirsty," Emily quickly lied. "Mrs. Smith gave me water." Patricia looked at the clean counter, then at the two of them. "Emily, go up to your room. Your math tutor will be here in an hour." "Yes, Patricia." The girl ran out, but before disappearing up the stairs, she looked back and winked at Mrs. Smith, a small gesture of complicity that warmed the cook's heart. "Mrs. Smith," Patricia's voice was sharp, "remember what we talked about unnecessary distractions." "Yes, Mrs. Patricia." "Emily already has enough problems without forming inappropriate bonds with the household staff. She needs to learn her place in the hierarchy of the house." Mrs. Smith nodded silently, but inside she was boiling. Hierarchy of the house? That girl needed affection, understanding, someone who saw her intelligence instead of her flaws. After Patricia left, Mrs. Smith finished cleaning the kitchen, but her mind was buzzing with plans. She had seen the sparkle in Emily's eyes when she learned real math, the ease with which she absorbed concepts that seemed impossible on paper. That child didn't have learning problems, she had teaching problems. Upstairs, she could hear the tutor's voice explaining addition algorithms with the patience of someone who had been repeating the same thing for years without results. And Emily's voice, growing quieter, responding, "I don't know," to everything. Mrs. Smith stored a portion of chocolate truffles in a small container and hid it at the back of the fridge. The next day, she would find a way to continue the lessons in the kitchen. After all, she had raised 6 children and helped educate 5 grandchildren. She knew very well that love and patience could teach more than any traditional method. Meanwhile, 3 floors up, Emily was lying on her bed, staring at the ceiling. For the first time in a long while, she had managed to truly understand math, and even better, it had been fun. She closed her eyes and tried to remember the smell of chocolate that had stuck to her shirt, a sweet reminder amidst the bitterness of the day. The weekend brought an unexpected change to the household routine. Dr. Richard, who usually spent Saturdays at the office preparing cases for the following week, decided to stay home to personally oversee his daughter's studies. He had hired a new tutor, Dr. Helen Martin, a renowned educator who charged $500 an hour and promised revolutionary results for children with learning difficulties. Mrs. Smith watched everything from downstairs while preparing breakfast. Through the kitchen intercom, she could hear voices coming from the library on the 2nd floor, where the lessons would take place. "Emily, let's start with basic concentration exercises," Dr. Helen said in a professorial voice, one that suggested she had studied at expensive universities. "I want you to focus on this red dot for 2 minutes without moving." Mrs. Smith furrowed her brow as she sliced fruits for the salad. She was familiar with that method. It was the same one they had tried to use with Lily before realizing that forcing concentration only increased the girl's anxiety. "Dad, I can't stop moving," Emily's voice came through muffled, laden with frustration. "Emily, you need to try harder," Dr. Richard replied. "Dr. Helen is here to help you, but you need to cooperate." "Let's try again," the educator said, "and this time without swinging your legs." Mrs. Smith quietly climbed the stairs, carrying a tray with water and cookies. She gently knocked on the library door. "Come in," Dr. Richard said. The library was an impressive space, with floor-to-ceiling shelves filled with legal books in various languages, a mahogany table in the center, and leather armchairs that cost more than an economy car. Emily was sitting in a chair that was too high for her, her feet swinging in the air as she tried to keep her eyes fixed on a small red circle that Dr. Helen held. The educator was a woman in her 40s, her hair pulled back in a tight bun, wearing a grey suit that made her look older. She carried a leather briefcase filled with tests, questionnaires, and methods that promised to correct cognitive deficits. "Thank you, Mrs. Smith," Dr. Richard said when she placed the tray on a side table. "You can leave it here." Mrs. Smith nodded but didn't leave immediately. Something in Emily's posture, the tension in her shoulders, the way she bit her lip, made her hesitate. "Doctor," she said carefully, "the girl didn't have a proper lunch today. Maybe she's hungry." "Mrs. Smith, please," Dr. Helen interrupted impatiently. "We are at a critical moment in the concentration exercise. We cannot have interruptions." Mrs. Smith looked at Emily, who was staring at her with pleading eyes. It was the same expression her granddaughter made when she felt overwhelmed. "Excuse me," she said, stepping out of the library, but she didn't go to the kitchen. Instead, she stood outside the door, listening to the continuation of the lesson. "Very well, Emily. Now we will move on to symbol decoding exercises," Dr. Helen announced. "I want you to identify which of these letters are in the correct position." I can't see properly," Emily murmured. "What do you mean you can't see? They are simple letters." Irritation was evident in the educator's voice. "They keep moving." "Emily, letters don't move," Dr. Richard said, his tone rising. "You need to concentrate for real." "Dr. Anderson," Dr. Helen interjected, "this is exactly the type of behavior we need to correct. The child is using mental tricks to avoid the real effort of learning." Mrs. Smith felt her blood boil. She was all too familiar with that type of specialist, people with expensive degrees but no real understanding of how different children learned. "Let's try a more direct method," the educator continued. "Emily, you will copy these sentences 50 times. This will train your motor coordination and memorization." 50 times, Emily's voice came out as a frightened whisper. "That's right, and no complaints." Mrs. Smith couldn't take it anymore. She knocked on the door again. "Sorry to interrupt," she said, entering without waiting for a response, "but the girl looks very pale. I think she might feel unwell." Indeed, Emily was pale, her hands trembling as she held the pencil in a clumsy position that showed the extreme effort she was making. "Mrs. Smith, I've already said we cannot have interruptions," Dr. Richard said, clearly irritated. "I've seen that color before, Doctor. When my granddaughter felt overwhelmed. If she feels unwell here..." Dr. Helen sighed in exasperation. "Look, I understand the staff's concern, but this kind of excessive compassion is exactly what is hindering the child's development." "Excessive compassion," Mrs. Smith repeated, unable to hide her indignation. "Yes, the child needs to learn that the real world demands discipline and effort. We cannot give in to every difficulty." Dr. Richard looked at his daughter, who was now silently crying as she tried to copy the sentences, and then at Mrs. Smith. For the first time, he seemed to hesitate. Maybe we can take a break for lunch," he finally said. "Dr. Anderson," the educator protested, "I do not recommend interrupting the process now. The child needs to learn, to overcome her resistances." "Resistances?" Mrs. Smith couldn't hold back. "The girl is not resisting, Doctor. She is trying the best she can." "Mrs. Smith, please," Dr. Richard raised his hand. "Dr. Helen is a specialist." "Sorry, Doctor, but a specialist in what? Making children cry?" The silence that followed was tense. Dr. Helen looked. "Adaptações, Dona Nair, Mrs. Smith, Feira de Santana, small town in Florida, Brigadeiro, chocolate truffles, Dr. Helena, Dr. Helen, Escadaria de Mármore, Marble Staircase, Dr. Ricardo Mendonça, Dr. Richard Anderson, colégio mais conceituado da cidade, most prestigious school. In the city, café da manhã, breakfast, professora, teacher, psicólogos infantis, child psychologists, Patricia, Elisa, Emily, Dr. Ricardo, Dr. Richard, Mrs. Smith looked at Emily as if she were an insect that had dared to speak, while Dr. Richard seemed torn between authority and doubt, and Emily continued to cry softly. "You know what," Mrs. Smith said, making a decision that could cost her job. "If you allow me, Doctor, I would like to show something." She approached Emily and crouched down beside her chair. "My angel, do you remember how we made chocolate truffles yesterday?" Emily nodded, wiping her tears. "Do you remember how many cups of sugar we used?" 2. "And if I wanted to make double the recipe, how many cups would I need?" Emily thought for a second. 4. "And if I wanted to make just half?" 1. "Perfect." Mrs. Smith smiled. "Now tell me, if we have 10 chocolate truffles and eat 3, how many are left?" 7. Mrs. Smith turned to the adults in the room. She just did addition, subtraction, multiplication, division and fractions mentally in less than a minute. Dr. Helen frowned. "But those are basic contextualized operations. It doesn't prove mathematical abstraction skills." "And why does an 8-year-old need mathematical abstraction?" Mrs. Smith countered. "Why can't she learn in a way that makes sense to her?" Dr. Richard looked at his daughter, who had stopped crying and was now looking at Mrs. Smith with admiration. It was the first time in months that he saw Emily answering math questions without hesitation. "Go on," he said to Mrs. Smith, ignoring the disapproving look from the educator. "Emily," Mrs. Smith said, "do you remember the story I told about my trip from a small town in Florida to Los Angeles? I remember. You said it was 800 kilometers. "That's right. And if I stop halfway, what city will I be in?" Emily thought for a bit. "In some city that is halfway. 400 kilometers? Exactly. You just calculated percentage and distance." Dr. Richard's face showed a mix of surprise and confusion. For the first time, he saw his daughter demonstrating clear logical reasoning and confidence in her answers. "That's very interesting," he said slowly, "but Emily also needs to learn to read and write conventionally." "And she will learn," Mrs. Smith replied, "but in her own way, at her own pace, with methods that make sense for how her brain works." Dr. Helen packed her materials with abrupt movements. "Dr. Anderson, I cannot work under these conditions. The interference from the domestic staff is undermining my professional authority." Dr. Richard looked at his daughter, who for the first time in weeks was not crying during a lesson, then at Mrs. Smith, who was looking at him with serene determination. "Dr. Helen," he finally said, "I think we will stop for today. I need to think about the methods." The educator left the library with her dignity wounded and her ego bruised. Dr. Richard remained silent for a few minutes, watching his daughter, who was now playing with the numbers on the sheet instead of fearing them. "Mrs. Smith," he finally said, "where did you learn these methods?" "From life, Doctor. From raising 6 children and helping 5 grandchildren, and from understanding that each child is unique." He nodded slowly, still processing what he had witnessed. "Can we talk later?" he asked. "Of course, Doctor." Mrs. Smith left the library knowing she had crossed a line, but when she looked back and saw Emily smiling, while drawing numbers shaped like chocolate truffles in the margin of her notebook, she knew she had done the right thing. Monday arrived loaded with tension. Dr. Richard had spent Sunday locked in his office, making calls and researching alternative teaching methods online. Patricia, for her part, was furious about the scandal from the previous Saturday and made her intentions clear during breakfast. "Richard, we need to talk about the situation with the staff member," she said, absent-mindedly stirring the organic sugar that cost $80 a pound. "What happened on Saturday was unacceptable." Dr. Richard sipped his black coffee. In silence, his eyes fixed on the financial newspaper, but Mrs. Smith could see from the tension in his shoulders that he was listening to every word. Mrs. Smith humiliated a renowned professional in our own home. Imagine if this gets to our social circles. A cook questioning educational methods? She didn't question methods, Dr. Richard said without looking up from the newspaper. She showed results. Patricia dropped the spoon into the pot with a metallic clatter. Results? Richard, you are letting an untrained woman influence your daughter's education. Our daughter, he corrected, finally looking at his wife. Of course, our daughter. And exactly for that reason, we cannot allow amateur experiments. Emily needs scientific methods, not kitchen tricks. Mrs. Smith, who was cleaning the kitchen counter, felt her stomach tighten. She knew her stay in the house was hanging by a thread. But during Sunday, she had heard Dr. Richard making several calls, some to educators, others to child psychologists, and realized he was genuinely concerned about finding answers. Patricia, Dr. Richard said, closing the newspaper, did you see Emily's face on Saturday? It was the first time in months that she didn't cry during a school activity. That doesn't mean anything. Children cry when they are challenged. It's part of the learning process. Or they cry when the methods are wrong for them. The silence that followed was broken only by the noise of the coffee machine and the ticking of the kitchen clock. Mrs. Smith continued her tasks, but every muscle in her body was tense. Richard, Patricia's voice dropped lower, more dangerously, you need to decide if you want an organized home with staff who know their places, or if you want a circus where anyone can opine on matters they don't understand. Dr. Richard stood up from the table, adjusted his tie, and grabbed his briefcase. I will think about it. After he left, Patricia turned to Mrs. Smith with a cold smile. Mrs. Smith, you understood the conversation, didn't you? Yes, Mrs. Patricia. Great, so there won't be any more educational experiments in my kitchen, is that clear? It is. But Mrs. Smith was lying. As Patricia went upstairs for another Pilates session, she secretly opened the cabinet where she kept her personal belongings and took out a small wooden box she had brought from Florida. Inside, along with some photographs of her children and grandchildren, there were several medical and educational reports about Lily. She knew she was risking everything, but she also knew that Emily was heading toward the same cliff that had almost destroyed her granddaughter. She couldn't just stand by. At 3 p.m, when Emily came home from school, Mrs. Smith was waiting with a glass of acerola juice and a warm smile. How was school today, my angel? Bad, Emily replied, sitting on the stool with her shoulders slumped. The teacher called me lazy in front of the whole class. Mrs. Smith's heart ached. Why did she say that? Because I couldn't read a text aloud. The words got all jumbled, and I started to stutter. Then everyone began to laugh. Mrs. Smith knew that pain all too well. Lily had gone through the same humiliation until they got the right diagnosis and treatment. Emily, she said, checking to see if they were really alone, can I show you something very important? The girl nodded, curious. Mrs. Smith opened the box and took out a photo of a girl who looked like Emily. The same brown hair, the same sweet gaze, the same expression of someone carrying an invisible weight. This is my granddaughter Lily, when she was your age. She looks sad, Emily observed. She really was. Because the teacher said she was dumb, lazy, that she didn't pay attention. But do you know what we discovered? Emily shook her head. Mrs. Smith pulled out a folded paper from the box. It was an official medical report with stamps and signatures. We found out that Lily's brain works in a special way. She has something called dyslexia. What is that? It's when a person is very smart, but reads and sees numbers differently. It's not an illness, it's not laziness, it's not stupidity. It's just a different way the brain works. Emily looked at the photo of Lily, then at the official paper that she couldn't read but seemed important. And what happened to her? When we discovered and started teaching her the right way, she became one of the best students in school. Now she's 15 and wants to be a veterinarian." Emily's eyes lit up. "Really? Really? And do you know why I think you might have the same thing?" "Why?" "Because you do exactly the same things she did. You mix up letters, see numbers moving, are super smart in some things and struggle in others." Mrs. Smith put the papers away and leaned closer to the girl. "Emily, can I ask you an important question?" "Sure. Have you ever seen your dad keeping papers about you in the office? Medical papers?" The girl hesitated, biting her lip. "Once I saw him reading some papers and crying. My name was on them." Mrs. Smith's heart raced. "Do you remember where he kept those papers?" "In the bottom drawer of the desk on the left side. He always locks it." Mrs. Smith knew she was crossing all possible lines, but she also knew that those papers could contain crucial answers. If Dr. Richard already had the diagnosis and was hiding it, that changed everything. "Emily," she said carefully, "do you trust me?" "I do. Then I need to ask you for something very important. Tonight, when your parents are sleeping, could you take a look at those papers?" "I don't know how to read well." "You don't need to read. You just need to take a picture with a cell phone and show me tomorrow." "But I don't have a cell phone," Mrs. Smith thought quickly. "Does your dad leave his cell phone charging on the nightstand?" "He does." "And do you both have the same fingerprint registered for emergencies?" "We do." "Then, if you can borrow it just for a few minutes." Emily looked nervous. "What if he finds out?" "My angel, sometimes we need to break small rules to discover important truths, and I think this truth could change your life." At that moment, they heard the front door open. Patricia had come back early. Quickly, Mrs. Smith put the box away and Emily grabbed her backpack. "Think about what I said, okay?" Mrs. Smith whispered. Emily nodded and ran upstairs to her room, but Mrs. Smith saw in her eyes a determination that hadn't been there before. The girl had understood that maybe she wasn't defective. Maybe she was just different. That night, after the house fell into silence, Mrs. Smith stayed awake in her room on the 3rd floor, looking out the window and praying softly. She knew she was asking a lot from an 8-year-old. But she also knew that sometimes children were braver than adults when it came to seeking the truth. Downstairs, on the 2nd floor, Emily was lying in bed listening to her father's deep breathing in the next room. Patricia had taken her usual sleeping pill and was already softly snoring. The house was in complete silence. The girl got up slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew that if she got caught, she would be in big trouble. But the conversation with Mrs. Smith had planted a seed of hope that she couldn't ignore. Maybe she wasn't dumb. Maybe there was an explanation for everything. And maybe, just maybe, those papers hidden in the locked drawer held the key to her freedom. The clock in the living room struck 2 in the morning when Emily finally gathered the courage to leave her room. The house was plunged into near darkness, broken only by the emergency lights that Dr. Richard had installed in the hallways. The girl knew every creaky floorboard, every groaning stair, the result of many nights spent in silence. Emily descended to get water or seek comfort in the kitchen after nightmares. Her bare feet touched the cold marble floor as she moved like a shadow toward her father's office. Her heart raced so loudly that she was sure the noise would wake the entire house. In her right hand, she held her father's cell phone. She had managed to grab it from the nightstand during the deep sleep that always overcame him after long days at the office. The office door was slightly ajar, as it always was, to allow the air conditioning to circulate. Emily slipped inside the room, where the moonlight filtered through the blinds, creating geometric patterns on the floor. The executive desk seemed even larger in the darkness, a mountain of mahogany dominating the space. She knelt beside the desk, and tried to open the lower left drawer. It was locked as she expected, but Emily knew where her father kept the keys. A small box disguised as a book on the shelf, nestled among volumes of tax law that no one ever touched. Her fingers trembled as she searched for the right key. Dr. Richard was meticulous with his organization, and each key had a small, discreet label. Desk, lower drawer. This was it. The drawer opened with an almost imperceptible creak. Inside, there were several folders organized alphabetically. Emily's heart stopped when she saw a folder with her name handwritten on it. Emily, Medical Documents Confidential. With trembling hands, she opened the folder. There was a stack of papers with letterheads from clinics, hospitals, and medical offices. Complicated names, official stamps, doctors' signatures. She could barely understand what was written, but some words jumped off the page. Dyslexia, ADHD, urgent recommendation, specialized follow-up. It was exactly what Mrs. Smith had suspected. Emily began to photograph each document with her father's cell phone, trying to keep her hands steady despite the shaking. There were reports from 3 different doctors, all reaching the same conclusions. The oldest was dated over a year ago. A year. Her father had known for over a year that she had dyslexia and had done nothing. Worse, he had hidden the information, allowing her to continue suffering, feeling stupid, being humiliated at school. Tears began to stream down Emily's face as she photographed the last documents. There were also treatment recommendations, lists of specialized professionals, adapted teaching methods. Everything was there. All the answers she needed to understand why learning was so difficult for her. Suddenly, she heard footsteps upstairs. Patricia had gotten up to go to the bathroom, as she did every night due to the diuretics she took to stay in shape. Emily quickly closed the folder, locked the drawer, and put the key back in its place. In a matter of seconds, she was out of the office, ascending the stairs like a ghost. She managed to return to her room and return her father's cell phone before Patricia finished in the bathroom. When she finally lay down in her own bed, her heart was still racing, but now for a different reason. It was no longer fear of being discovered. It was anger at having suffered for so long unnecessarily. Anger at feeling defective when she actually just had a condition that could be treated. Anger at all the red zeros on her report card, all the tears, all the sleepless nights, studying things her brain couldn't process in the traditional way. But along with the anger, there was something new. Hope. If she really had dyslexia and ADHD, it meant she wasn't stupid. It meant she could learn. She just needed the right method. It meant Mrs. Smith had been right all along. The next morning, Emily descended for breakfast with puffy eyes. From crying, but with a determination Dr. Richard had never seen before, he was sitting at the table, as always, reading the newspaper and answering emails on his phone at the same time. "Good morning, Dad," she said, sitting across from him. "Good morning, dear. How did you sleep?" "Well," she lied. "Dad, can I ask you a question?" Dr. Richard looked over the newspaper, noticing something different in his daughter's tone. "Of course. What is dyslexia?" The newspaper almost slipped from Dr. Richard's hands. He looked at Emily with an expression that mixed surprise, panic, and guilt. Why are you asking this?" "Mrs. Smith explained to me about her granddaughter. She said she had dyslexia, and that's why she couldn't learn in school." Dr. Richard placed the newspaper on the table and took off his glasses, rubbing his temples as he always did when he was nervous. "Emily, these are very complicated things for children to understand." "I'm not stupid, Dad," she said with a firmness that surprised him. "If I have something, I want to know." The silence that followed was interrupted by Patricia's arrival, wearing a pink silk robe and carrying her morning green smoothie. What are you two talking about so early? She asked, sitting next to her husband. Emily is asking about medical conditions, Dr. Richard said carefully. What medical conditions? Emily looked directly into her stepmother's eyes. Dyslexia, ADHD, the things I have that you hid from me. Patricia nearly choked on her smoothie. What are you talking about? I'm talking about the papers Dad keeps in the locked drawer of the office. The medical reports with my name on them. The colour drained from Dr. Richard's face. Emily, how did you— That doesn't matter, she interrupted. What matters is that you knew I had an explanation for my difficulties and let me suffer, feeling stupid, being humiliated at school. Dr. Richard stood up from his chair, running his hands through his hair. Emily, you don't understand. These diagnoses, they would label you. They would limit your future opportunities. Limit me? Emily's voice rose an octave. Dad, I'm already limited. I can't learn anything at school. Teachers think I'm lazy. My classmates laugh at me. At that moment, Mrs. Smith entered the dining room, carrying a pitcher of fresh orange juice. She immediately sensed the tension in the air and Emily's red eyes. Excuse me, she said, placing the pitcher on the table. Mrs. Smith, said Dr. Richard, his voice heavy with accusation, did you talk about dyslexia with my daughter? I did, yes, sir, because I recognized the signs. You had no right. I had a duty, Mrs. Smith interrupted with a courage that surprised everyone. The duty of someone who has been through this and knows that hiding the truth only makes things worse. Patricia stood up, furious. Richard, this is unacceptable. This woman is interfering in private family matters. And you are neglecting a child, Mrs. Smith retorted. You've had the diagnoses for over a year and have done nothing. How do you know about— Dr. Richard stopped mid-sentence, looking at Emily. Did you tell her about the documents? Emily nodded, unapologetic. Emily Maria Anderson, Patricia exploded. Did you rummage through your father's office? This is unacceptable. You know what's unacceptable, Emily shouted, standing up from her chair for the first time in her life to confront the adults. It's hiding from me that I have a condition that explains everything. It's letting me suffer when there's treatment. It's making me believe I'm defective when in fact you are the ones who are wrong. The silence that followed was broken only by the hum of the air conditioner and the pounding hearts of everyone in the room. It was the first time Emily had shouted, the first time she had rebelled, the first time she demanded answers. Dr. Richard sat heavily in his chair, his face in his hands. You don't understand, Emily. I wanted to protect you. I wanted you to have a normal life. Normal? She laughed. But it was too bitter a laugh for an 8-year-old. Dad, my life is not normal. I cry every day because of school. I have no friends. I feel stupid all the time. Is that normal for you? Mrs. Smith approached Emily and placed her hand on the girl's shoulder. Dr. Richard, can I say something? He looked at her, defeated. Speak. Hiding Emily's condition won't make it disappear. It will only make her suffer more. My granddaughter went through the same thing. When we finally got the right diagnosis and treatment, her life changed completely. And what kind of life is that? Patricia asked sarcastically. A girl forever marked as special. A girl who understands how her brain works, Mrs. Smith replied firmly. A girl who learned to use her differences as advantages. A girl who today has self-esteem and confidence. Dr. Richard looked at his daughter, who was staring at him with a mix of hurt and hope. For the first time, he truly saw what he had done. In trying to protect her from stigma, he had allowed her to carry a much heavier burden, the guilt of believing she was defective. Emily, he said, his voice choked. Will you forgive me? The girl looked at her father for a long moment, then at Mrs. Smith, who nodded encouragingly. Only if you promise that we will seek real treatment and that you won't hide things from me anymore. I promise." Patricia threw the napkin on the table and stood up. "Very well. You can resolve this situation however you want. But I will not participate in a circus where employees have more authority than family." She stormed out of the room, leaving behind her expensive perfume and an even more tense atmosphere. Dr. Richard looked at Mrs. Smith. "Do you have any suggestions on where to start?" "I do, Doctor. I know an excellent educational psychologist who works with children with dyslexia, and I can help Emily with adaptive methods while she starts official treatment." "And would you do that?" "Doctor," Mrs. Smith said with a smile, "it's not work, it's love." Emily ran to hug Mrs. Smith, and for the first time in a long time, Dr. Richard saw his daughter smile genuinely. The 3 months that followed completely transformed the dynamics of the house in Beverly Hills. Dr. Richard, confronted with the reality he had tried to deny, dove headfirst into finding solutions. He cancelled business trips, reorganized his schedule, and for the first time since his wife's death, prioritized his daughter over legal proceedings. The first change was hiring Dr. Sophia Martin, an educational psychologist specializing in dyslexia and ADHD, recommended by Mrs. Smith. Unlike Dr. Helen, Sophia was a 40-year-old black woman with curly hair styled in colorful braids and an approach that blended science with humanity. She had studied at UCLA, but also grew up in the outskirts, understanding both the theory and the reality of children who needed different methods. "Emily," Dr. Sophia said during the first consultation, sitting on the floor of the library next to the girl, "I want you to know something very important. Your brain is fantastic. It just works in a special way." Dr. Richard watched from the leather armchair, still getting used to a professional who didn't wear suits or speak in incomprehensible technical terms. "What do you mean special?" Emily asked, playing with a Rubik's Cube that the educational psychologist had brought. "You see the world in a way that other people don't. For example, when you look at this cube, I bet you can imagine how it looks when you twist the pieces, right?" Emily nodded, manipulating the toy with impressive ease. "That's because your brain processes spatial information exceptionally. Many people with dyslexia are like that. They struggle with some things but are brilliant in others." Meanwhile, in the kitchen, Mrs. Smith was developing a true pedagogical revolution. With Dr. Richard's official permission, she transformed Emily's afternoons into practical learning laboratories. Geography became regional recipes. Let's make regional dishes to understand climatic differences. Math. The culinary measurements transformed into practical questions. If the recipe is for 4 people and we are making it for 6, how much do we need to increase? And history came alive through regional traditions. "Mrs. Smith," Emily said one Thursday afternoon, stirring the cornmeal cake batter, "why is it easier to learn here than at school?" "Because here you use your whole body to learn, my dear. At school, they want you to learn only with your eyes and ears. But your brain needs to touch, smell, and feel." Dr. Richard, who had started arriving earlier from the office to attend these classes, watched from the door. He saw his daughter performing complex mental calculations while adjusting ingredients, discussing the history of Italian immigration through the recipe for mashed potatoes, learning basic chemistry by observing how the baking powder made the batter rise. "She's learning more in 3 weeks than in 3 years of traditional classes," he commented to Dr. Sophia during a consultation. "That's how it works with dyslexic children," the educational psychologist explained. "They need context, movement, and multisensory experiences. Their brains process information differently, but not inferiorly." The second transformation happened at school. After a tense meeting with the educational coordination, where Dr. Richard presented the official medical reports and Dr. Sophia's recommendations, Emily finally received the accommodations she needed. Extra time for tests, texts in specific fonts, permission to use a recorder in class, and support from a teaching assistant. But the biggest transformation was happening at home. Patricia, who initially tried to sabotage the changes, gradually lost influence. Dr. Richard had made a firm decision. His daughter's education would be the top priority, and any interference would be unacceptable. "Richard," she said one morning while having her protein shake, "you need to see what's happening with our social routine. We've cancelled 3 important dinners because of these sessions with the educational psychologist." "And we will cancel as many as necessary," he replied, without looking up from his laptop. "This is affecting your business. Valerie mentioned yesterday at the club that you've been absent from elite legal gatherings." Dr. Richard closed the laptop and looked directly at his wife. "Patricia, for years I prioritized business while my daughter suffered. That's over." "But it's over," he repeated firmly. The third transformation was the deepest, the relationship between father and daughter. Dr. Richard began to actively participate in Emily's activities, first as an observer, then as a supporter. He learned to make chocolate truffles with Mrs. Smith to understand how his daughter processed mathematics. He sat on the library floor to assemble puzzles with Dr. Sophia. For the first time in years, he was truly getting to know his daughter. "Daddy," Emily said one night as he helped her with a school project about colonial America, "why did it take you so long to understand me?" The question hit Dr. Richard like a punch in the stomach. He stopped gluing pictures on the poster and looked at the girl. "Because I was scared, dear." "Scared of what?" "Scared that you were different. Scared that people would judge you. Scared of not knowing how to help you." Emily thought for a moment. "But I've always been different, Daddy. Now I just know why. And does that bother you?" "No," she smiled. "Dr. Sophia said many geniuses were dyslexic. Einstein, Leonardo da Vinci." "That's right. So maybe being different isn't so bad after all." Dr. Richard hugged his daughter, feeling a mix of pride and remorse. Pride for the early wisdom she was developing, remorse for the lost years denying her true nature. The 4th month brought the first concrete results. Emily received her first blue grade in math, a 7 that made her run through the house shouting with joy. The test had been adapted. Instead of solving abstract problems, she tackled practical situations involving recipes, distances, and proportions. "Mrs. Smith," she shouted, bursting into the kitchen like a whirlwind, "I got a 7. I knew it, my dear. I always knew you could do it." The two danced around the kitchen while Dr. Richard watched from the door, his eyes misty. It was the first time he had seen his daughter celebrate a school achievement. But not everything was perfect. Patricia intensified her campaign against the changes, arguing that the house had turned into a rehabilitation center and that this was harming the family's social image. "Richard, Valerie mentioned yesterday that you hired a black educational psychologist from the outskirts," she said during a tense dinner. "Can you imagine what they're thinking about our standards?" "They're thinking that we've finally decided to help our daughter instead of hiding her problems," he replied, cutting the meat with more force than necessary. "And what about the cook? She's practically become an unofficial tutor. Is that appropriate?" "It's effective. And right now, effectiveness matters more than social conventions." Mrs. Smith, who was serving dinner, listened in silence. She knew her position in the house had changed drastically. She was no longer just the cook. She'd become a fundamental part of Emily's education. But she also knew this created tensions that could explode at any moment. The explosion came on a Friday night. Patricia had organized a dinner for Dr. Richard's important clients, and everything needed to be perfect. But Emily was having a tough day, a panic attack caused by a surprise test at school, and needed Mrs. Smith's support. "Smith, Patricia said coldly. You need to choose. Either you're a cook and prepare dinner properly, or you're a babysitter and lose your job. Mrs. Smith looked at Emily, who was sitting in the corner of the kitchen, hugging her knees and trying to control her rapid breathing. Then she looked at Patricia with her expensive clothes and absolute insensitivity. Mrs. Patricia, she said calmly, dinner is ready, but this girl needs support right now, and I need you to do your job. My job, Mrs. Smith said, approaching Emily, is to take care of this family, and this includes taking care of this child's heart. Patricia turned red with anger. Richard, she shouted, come here right now. Dr. Richard appeared in the kitchen, still in his suit, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt. What's going on? He looked around. Dinner was impeccably set on the table. Mrs. Smith was kneeling next to Emily, helping her with breathing exercises, and Patricia was standing with her arms crossed, furious. Patricia, he said after a few seconds, dinner is ready. Mrs. Smith is doing exactly what I would expect her to do. This is unacceptable. What is unacceptable? Dr. Richard said, his voice rising, is you prioritizing client impressions over my daughter's well-being. Patricia looked at her husband as if she were seeing him for the first time. You've changed, Richard, and not for the better. You're right, he replied. I have changed. I finally understand what really matters. That night, after the guests had left, and Emily was sleeping peacefully, Dr. Richard found Mrs. Smith organizing the kitchen. Smith, he said, thank you for everything. You're welcome, Doctor. Emily is a special girl. She is, and you saw her when I was blind. Mrs. Smith smiled. Sometimes we need different eyes to see the truth, right, Doctor? Dr. Richard nodded, thinking about how a simple woman from rural Florida had managed to do what years of expensive education could not, teach his daughter to learn and believe in herself. The 6th month brought a crisis that no one had foreseen. Mrs. Smith received a call from Florida on a Tuesday morning that would change everything. Her mother, Mrs. Johnson, 82 years old, had suffered a stroke and was hospitalized in critical condition. Dr. Richard, she said, her hands trembling as she held the phone, I need to travel urgently. My mother... She couldn't finish the sentence. Dr. Richard, who was having coffee before leaving for the office, immediately understood the gravity of the situation. Of course, Smith. Go right now. Do you need money? For the ticket? No, sir, I have saved up, but... But what about Emily? She's in such a good phase with her studies. Dr. Richard looked at the woman who had transformed his daughter's life. Even in her own despair, she was thinking first of Emily. Smith, your mother is the priority now. Emily will understand. Mrs. Smith nodded, but her eyes were filled with tears. I don't know how long I'll be gone. Stay as long as you need. Your job will be here when you return. What neither of them expected was Patricia's reaction when she learned of the situation. What a perfect opportunity, she murmured to herself, a cold smile on her face. When Emily came home from school and found out that Mrs. Smith had travelled to care for her sick mother, her first reaction was genuine concern. Is she going to be okay? She asked, her eyes wide with worry. Her mother is very ill, dear, Dr. Richard explained. Mrs. Smith needs to be there. Can I send her a letter? Of course you can. But as the days passed, Mrs. Smith's absence was felt devastatingly. Patricia had hired a new cook, Mrs. Rosa, a 50-year-old woman, efficient but cold and formal. There were no more lessons in the kitchen, no more math truffles, no more comforting conversations after school. Emily tried to adapt, but it was as if she had lost her main source of emotional support. Her grades, which had been consistently improving, began to fluctuate again. The anxiety attacks, which had decreased drastically, returned with a vengeance. Dad, she said one Thursday night, as they tried to do math homework together. "When is Mrs. Smith coming back?" "I don't know, dear. Her mother is still very ill." "But I need her." Emily's voice came out small, vulnerable. Dr. Richard felt his heart tighten. He had underestimated how essential Mrs. Smith had become in his daughter's life. Patricia watched everything from a distance, waiting for the right moment to act. In the third week of Mrs. Smith's absence, when Emily had cried 3 times during homework and Dr. Richard was clearly desperate, she decided to strike. "Richard," she said one morning, fixing her platinum hair in the vanity mirror, "we need to talk about Emily's situation." "What situation?" "Don't you see? She's completely dependent on an employee. This isn't healthy." Dr. Richard stopped brushing his teeth. "Smith is not just an employee, Patricia. She is an employee who has created an unhealthy emotional dependency in a vulnerable child." "What dependency?" Emily was improving. She was becoming addicted to a type of attention that isn't sustainable. What will happen when this woman leaves for good? When she decides to return to Florida for good? Dr. Richard had no answer to that, and Patricia saw the doubt in her husband's eyes. "Look at the situation now," she continued. 3 weeks without Mrs. Smith and Emily is falling apart. This proves that the relationship wasn't healthy, or it proves that Mrs. Smith is important to her. "Richard, you need to be practical. Emily needs to learn to deal with formal educational authorities, not cling to maternal substitutes." The mention of maternal substitute hit Dr. Richard like a stab. It was true that since his wife's death, Emily had grown close to Mrs. Smith in a way that went beyond their professional relationship. "What are you suggesting?" "That we use this time to make a transition. We hire a qualified educational governess, someone with formal pedagogical training. And when Mrs. Smith comes back?" Patricia shrugged. "Maybe it would be better for everyone if she didn't come back, for Emily's own good." Dr. Richard remained silent for several minutes, processing his wife's suggestion. Part of him knew that Patricia was being manipulative, but another part wondered if she was right about the emotional dependency. That afternoon, he called Dr. Sophia to discuss the situation. "Dr. Richard," said the educational psychologist after hearing the whole story, "can I be honest with you?" "Of course." "Emily is not dependent on Mrs. Smith. She feels abandoned by someone who loved and understood her. Those are very different things. But what if Mrs. Smith decides not to come back? How will Emily cope? We'll cross that bridge when we get there. For now, what she needs to know is that the people who love her don't just disappear from her life without explanation." "Do you think we should keep in touch with Mrs. Smith while she's in Florida?" "I think it's essential. Emily needs to know that this bond still exists, even from a distance." That night, Dr. Richard helped Emily make a video call to Mrs. Smith. The connection was poor, the image froze, but when the familiar face of the cook appeared on the screen, Emily cried with relief. "Mrs. Smith, how is your mother?" "Slowly improving, my angel. And you, how are your studies?" "Difficult," Emily admitted. "I can't do math without you." "Of course you can. You're smart, remember? What's difficult?" "Fractions." Mrs. Smith smiled, even from over 1,000 miles away. "Remember how we did it? Take a cake or a pizza or anything round." For 40 minutes, through a pixelated screen and an unstable connection, Mrs. Smith gave a math lesson that was more effective than any formal method. Dr. Richard watched in amazement as his daughter began to smile again and understand concepts that had seemed impossible just moments before. When they hung up, Emily looked noticeably calmer. "Daddy," she said, "Mrs. Smith is coming back, right?" Dr. Richard looked at his daughter, thinking of Patricia's words about dependency and Dr. Sophia's words about love. "She will come back as soon as she can, dear." Do you promise you won't send her away?" The question surprised Dr. Richard. How had an 8-year-old realized that this possibility existed? "Why are you asking that?" "Because Patricia told Mrs. Johnson that it might be better to hire someone more qualified when Mrs. Smith comes back." Dr. Richard felt a mix of anger and disappointment. Patricia was manipulating the situation behind their backs, planting doubts and uncertainties in a child already fragile. "Emily," he said, holding his daughter's hands, "Mrs. Smith is part of our family. No one is going to send her away." "Do you promise?" "I promise." That night, after Emily fell asleep, Dr. Richard had a serious conversation with Patricia. "I don't want any more interference in the situation with Mrs. Smith," he said firmly. "Richard, you were trying to sabotage a relationship that is fundamental to our daughter's well-being. I was trying to protect Emily from an unhealthy dependency." "No," Dr. Richard said, his voice low but firm. "You were trying to eliminate someone who has a more positive influence in Emily's life than you do." Patricia fell silent, her face red with anger and humiliation. "From now on," he continued, "any decision regarding Emily's education and well-being will be mine, exclusively mine." "What if I don't agree?" Dr. Richard looked directly into his wife's eyes. "Then you will have to choose your priorities." The threat was not explicit, but it was clear. Patricia had lost the battle for control of the situation. 3 days later, Mrs. Smith called with news. Her mother was recovering well, and the doctor said she could return to Los Angeles in 2 weeks, leaving her mother in the care of her sisters. "Dr. Richard," she said, her voice emotional, "thank you so much for giving me this time. I don't know how to thank you." "Mrs. Smith, you don't have to thank me. Family takes care of family." "How is Emily?" "Anxious for you to come back, and we all are too." When Dr. Richard told Emily that Mrs. Smith would return in 2 weeks, the girl screamed with joy and ran around the house as if she had won the lottery. Patricia watched the scene from the living room door, her lips pressed into a thin line of defeat and resentment. She knew she had lost much more than a battle over an employee. She had lost any chance of controlling the new family dynamic that was forming. And deep down, a part of her knew that perhaps this was exactly what the family needed. Mrs. Smith's return was like the sun, shining again in the Beverly Hills house. Emily had been waiting at the door since 5 in the morning, even knowing that the flight would only arrive at noon. When she finally heard the noise of the automatic gate, she ran down the stairs so quickly that she almost tripped over her own feet. "Mrs. Smith!" she shouted, throwing herself into the arms of the woman who had become much more than a cook. Mrs. Smith hugged her tightly, her eyes brimming with tears. A month away had felt like a year. Throughout her stay in Florida, even while caring for her sick mother, she constantly thought about Emily, worried about her progress in studies and her emotional well-being. "My angel, how you've grown," she said, pulling the girl back to observe her better. "And those shining eyes, tell me everything." Dr. Richard watched the scene from the top of the stairs, a mix of relief and emotion washing over him. During the 4 weeks of Mrs. Smith's absence, he had realized how essential she had become, not just for Emily, but for the entire family dynamic. "Mrs. Smith," he said, coming down to greet her, "welcome back. How is your mother?" "Better, doctor. Thank God. The doctor said she will recover completely. She just needs physical therapy." "What a relief. And you? How are you feeling?" "Happy to be back," she replied sincerely. "I miss this place so much. Emily, you, even this huge kitchen." Patricia came down the stairs at that moment, wearing a pristine white dress and a forced smile. "Mrs. Smith, it's great to have you back. We hope you resolved your family issues." Mrs. Smith greeted her politely, but immediately sensed the coldness in her tone. During her absence, Emily had Elisa called to discuss some comments her stepmother had made, and she knew her position in the house was more fragile than ever. "Mrs. Smith," said Emily, pulling her by the hand, "I need to show you something." They went to the kitchen, where Emily proudly opened a new notebook filled with math exercises. "Look, I managed to do division by myself. I used the method you taught me from the recipes." Mrs. Smith examined the calculations, her heart swelling with pride. The girl had applied the practical methods they had developed together, adapting them to solve abstract problems from the textbook. "My angel, you are a genius, and these grades. I got an A in math last week, but it was hard without you here to help me. But you did it, and that's the most important thing. It shows that you don't depend on me to be smart. You just needed to figure out how your intelligence works." Dr. Richard, who had followed the two into the kitchen, watched the interaction with growing admiration. Mrs. Smith was not just teaching Emily. She was building her self-confidence, her independence, her understanding of her own abilities. "Mrs. Smith," he said, "can I talk to you later? I have some proposals to discuss." "Of course, Doctor." That afternoon, after Emily went to class with Dr. Sophia, Dr. Richard called Mrs. Smith for a conversation in the office. She entered nervously, fearing it was a disguised farewell. "Please have a seat," he said, gesturing to one of the leather armchairs that were usually reserved for important clients. Mrs. Smith sat at the edge of the chair, her hands clasped in her lap. "Nair, during your absence I've had a lot of time to think about your contribution to this family." She held her breath. "And I've come to the conclusion that you are not our employee. You are Emily's educator, our advisor, an essential part of this household." "Doctor, let me finish." He gently raised his hand. "I want to formalize your new position, no longer as a cook, but as the Educational and Family Wellness Coordinator." Mrs. Smith looked at him in confusion. "I don't understand." "I want you to be officially responsible for Emily's alternative educational development, with a corresponding salary, of course, 3 times what you currently earn." "But, Doctor, I don't have a degree." "You have something more valuable than a degree. You have wisdom, intuition, and genuine love for my daughter, and you achieve results that expensive professionals have not." Mrs. Smith was silent for a moment, processing the proposal. It was much more than she had dreamed of when she left her small town in Florida. "And what about Patricia? Does she agree with this?" Dr. Richard sighed. "Patricia's opinion on Emily's educational matters is no longer relevant. She has made her position clear, and I have made mine clear. Doctor, I don't want to cause problems in your marriage." "Nair, my marriage already has much deeper problems than your presence here, and right now my absolute priority is Emily's well-being." At that moment, Patricia appeared at the office door without knocking. "Richard, we need to—" "Oh," she stopped upon seeing Mrs. Smith sitting in the client chair. "Sorry, I didn't know you were in a meeting." "Come in, Patricia. Actually, it's good you're here. I was explaining to Nair her new position in the house." "New position?" "Emily's Educational and Family Wellness Coordinator." Patricia's face went through several expressions: surprise, indignation, controlled anger. "Coordinator, educational?" "That's right, with all the responsibilities and authority that the position entails." Patricia looked at Mrs. Smith, who remained still in the chair, then back at her husband. "Richard, can I speak to you privately?" "That's not necessary. Nair is part of this family now. We have no secrets." "Richard, the decision has already been made, Patricia." The silence that followed was tense. Patricia looked at Mrs. Smith with a mix of envy and defeat. A simple woman from the countryside had achieved in a few months what she had not in years: the genuine respect of Dr. Richard and the unconditional love of Emily. "Very well," she finally said. I hope everyone is prepared for the consequences of this decision." She left the office with heavy steps, leaving behind a silence filled with tension. "Doctor," said Mrs. Smith after a few minutes, "I accept the proposal, but with one condition." "What?" "I want to use part of the money to bring my granddaughter Lily to study in Los Angeles. I want her and Emily to meet and help each other." Dr. Richard smiled for the first time in the conversation. "I think that's an excellent idea. Emily can benefit greatly from being around someone who has faced the same challenges. And I want to continue cooking too. I don't want to lose that. Of course, the kitchen will always be your domain." That night, during dinner, Dr. Richard officially announced Mrs. Smith's new position to Emily. "So Mrs. Smith is going to be my official teacher?" asked the girl, her eyes shining. "More than that," replied her father. "She will be responsible for creating special methods for you to learn in your unique way." "And will she continue making math truffles?" "I will make all the sweets you want, my angel," laughed Mrs. Smith. Patricia ate in silence, cutting the meat with more force than necessary. She was lost in her own thoughts, planning her next strategy, or perhaps just accepting that she had lost the control she thought she had. After dinner, while Mrs. Smith was helping Emily with her homework at the kitchen table, Dr. Richard went upstairs to find Patricia packing her bags. "Are you leaving?" "Temporarily," she replied without looking at him. "I'm going to spend a few days at my sister's house. I need to think." "Think about what?" "About whether I still want to be part of a family where an employee has more authority than the stepmother. Nair is no longer an employee, and authority is not about hierarchy, it's about competence and love." Patricia stopped folding clothes and looked at him. "Are you in love with her?" The question caught Dr. Richard by surprise. "With Nair? No, Patricia. I have gratitude, respect and affection for her, but don't confuse that with romance. Then it's even worse. You chose her over me based on merits." Dr. Richard fell silent for a moment, processing the accusation. There was an uncomfortable truth there. "I chose my daughter's well-being," he finally said, "and if that means valuing someone who genuinely cares for her more than someone who sees her as an obstacle, then yes, I made my choice." Patricia finished packing her bag and turned to her husband. "When you decide what you really want from this family, call me." She left the room, and a few minutes later, Dr. Richard heard her car leaving the garage. He went down to the kitchen, where he found a scene that warmed his heart. Emily was sitting on the counter, swinging her legs while solving math problems, and Mrs. Smith was patiently guiding her, turning each calculation into a little story or practical metaphor. "Daddy," Emily said when she saw him, "Mrs. Smith taught me to do multiplication with music. Want to see?" And there, in the kitchen that had become the educational center of the house, Dr. Richard watched his daughter sing multiplication tables adapted to folk melodies, finally understanding that family was not about social status or conventions. It was about people who genuinely cared for one another. "Mrs. Smith," he said when Emily went upstairs to brush her teeth, "thank you for teaching me not just how to help my daughter, but how to be a better father." "Doctor," she replied with a smile, "that's what family is. We help each other, right?" And that night, for the first time in years, the house in Beverly Hills was truly at peace. 2 years had passed since Mrs. Smith officially became the family's educational coordinator. The house in Beverly Hills had completely transformed, not just in decoration, which now included Florida plants in the garden and a small art studio on the 3rd floor, but mainly in the atmosphere, which breathed life, learning, and genuine love. Emily, now 10 years old, was unrecognizable. The shy and insecure girl had transformed into a confident, curious child, passionate about learning. Her grades were consistently high, but more importantly, she had discovered her passion for astronomy and experimental cooking, uniquely combining the sciences with creativity. "Mrs. Smith," she said one Saturday morning, stirring a strange mixture in a bowl, "if I increase the baking temperature of the cake by 15%, how much do I need to decrease the time?" "It depends on the type of batter, my angel. A light batter like sponge cake requires a different calculation than a dense batter like chocolate cake." It was a scene that repeated almost daily. Emily turning the kitchen into a laboratory, applying math, chemistry and physics to her culinary experiments, always guided by Mrs. Smith's practical wisdom and the theoretical knowledge she had acquired from Dr. Sophia. Dr. Richard watched from the door, still marveling at the transformation. He himself had changed drastically. He had learned to balance work and family in a way he never thought possible. His legal cases continued to be successful, but now he came home every night at 6 to have dinner with his daughter and hear about her discoveries of the day. "Daddy," Emily ran to him, "come see, I'm doing an experiment on density using cake batters." Dr. Richard followed her to the counter, where several containers held different mixtures in various colorful layers. "It's for the school science project," she explained. "I want to show how different ingredients have different densities and how that affects the final texture of the cake." "Fantastic! And how did you come up with that idea?" "Mrs. Smith told me about the different types of flour that exist in Florida, and then I thought, why does each one result in different textures? Then I researched molecular density and—" She continued, explaining with a passion and knowledge that left Dr. Richard moved. His daughter had not only overcome learning difficulties, she had developed her own method of connecting practical and theoretical knowledge in a creative and original way. "And Lily? How is she adapting?" he asked. Lily, Mrs. Smith's granddaughter, had moved to Los Angeles 6 months earlier. Initially shy and wary of life in the big city, she quickly became Emily's best friend and an excellent student at the private school where Dr. Richard had enrolled her. "She's up there finishing her project on astronomy," Emily replied. "We're going to present together at the science fair. She talks about Florida constellations, and I talk about how to calculate stellar distances using proportions." The partnership between the two girls had been more successful than anyone expected. Lily brought stories from the rural areas, knowledge about medicinal plants, and a different perspective on resilience. Emily, in turn, shared with her friend the educational resources she had at her disposal and the confidence she had developed in her own abilities. "Mrs. Smith," Dr. Richard said, "how are you feeling about all these changes?" The question carried significant meaning. In recent weeks, several private schools had approached Mrs. Smith to develop adaptive teaching programs based on the methods she had created for Emily. A university had even offered her a scholarship to study education, recognizing her natural talent. "Happy, Doctor. Very happy," she replied sincerely. "I never imagined my homemade methods could interest so many important people. They interest people because they work. You have developed something revolutionary, a way of teaching that respects how each brain processes information." At that moment, Lily came running down the stairs, carrying a huge poster about constellations. "Aunt Smith! Emily! Come see how it turned out." The two rushed to admire the work. The poster showed the map of the sky as seen from rural Florida, with traditional stories about each constellation written in beautiful handwriting. "Lily, how beautiful!" exclaimed Mrs. Smith. "Your mother will be so proud when she hears." The girl smiled. Emily's eyes sparkled. The move to Los Angeles had been difficult, but it was worth it. She was in an excellent school, living in a comfortable house, and most importantly, she had seen her grandmother transform into a respected educator. "Mrs. Smith," said Dr. Richard, "I have some exciting news." Everyone turned to him. Curious. The State Department of Education contacted me. They want you to coordinate a pilot program for adaptive education for children with dyslexia and ADHD. Mrs. Smith was taken aback. Me, Doctor? You. They recognize that your methods are more effective than many official programs out there. But what about Emily and the house? The program would be part-time. You would continue being our educational coordinator in the morning and work with other children in the afternoon. Emily jumped for joy. Mrs. Smith, you're going to help other boys and girls like me. Like us, corrected Lily, smiling. Mrs. Smith wiped her hands on her apron, an automatic gesture she made when she was emotional. Doctor, I accept, but I want one condition. What is it? I want Emily and Lily to be my junior assistants. They can help other children understand that being different doesn't mean being defective. I think that's perfect, agreed Dr. Richard. That afternoon, while the girls played in the garden and Mrs. Smith prepared dinner, Dr. Richard went upstairs to the office and opened the drawer where he had kept Emily's medical reports for so long. Now, those documents were in a clear folder, alongside a collection of schoolwork with excellent grades and letters from teachers praising the girls' exceptional progress. He smiled as he remembered how he had tried to hide Emily's dyslexia, as if it were a family shame. Today, she spoke openly about her condition, explaining to her classmates how her brain worked differently and how that made her better in certain areas. The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. Hello? Richard, it's Patricia. He sighed. His ex-wife, they had amicably divorced 8 months earlier, called occasionally, always with a tone that mixed regret and curiosity. Hi, Patricia. How are you? Good. I heard that. Mrs. Smith has become a famous educator. She is being recognized for the exceptional work she has always done. And Emily? How is she? Wonderful. Happy, confident, learning amazing things every day. There was a long pause on the line. Richard, I was wrong. About everything. We all make mistakes, Patricia. But I made mistakes out of pride, out of prejudice. That woman saw things in Emily that I could never see. Dr. Richard chose his words carefully. Mrs. Smith saw Emily as a unique child with specific needs and immense potential. That made all the difference. Can I visit them someday? I would like to see how Emily is. I'll ask her. If she wants, of course you can. When he hung up, Dr. Richard went down to the kitchen, where he found a scene that had become routine. Emily teaching Lily to do calculations using ingredients, while Mrs. Smith patiently guided them both. Girls, he said, do you want to hear a story? They sat at the table, curious. Once upon a time, there was a father who thought love meant giving his daughter everything money could buy. But he was wrong. He discovered that true love means seeing the child as she really is, not as you want her to be. And what happened to that father? Asked Emily. He learned that sometimes the most educated people are not those with the most degrees, but those with the biggest hearts. Mrs. Smith smiled, understanding the message. And what about the daughter of the father in the story? Lily asked. She discovered that being different was not a curse. It was a gift. And she used that gift to help other children discover their own hidden treasures. The girls applauded, and Mrs. Smith served dinner with a full heart. 3 years earlier, she had been a simple cook in a cold, silent house. Today, she was a respected educator in a home filled with love, laughter, and learning. That night, after the girls went to sleep, Dr. Richard and Mrs. Smith sat in the garden sipping lemon balm tea and watching the stars. Mrs. Smith, he said, thank you for teaching me that family is not about blood or status. It's about people who care for one another. Doctor, she replied, Thank you for giving me the chance to discover that I had much more to offer than I ever imagined. You always did. You just needed someone to recognize it. And you have always been a good father. You just needed to learn to listen to your heart instead of your ego." They sat in silence, contemplating the starry sky that Lily had mapped in her project. Each constellation told a story, just as each person in that house had found their own way to shine. The following week, when Mrs. Smith's official program was announced in the newspapers, dozens of families reached out seeking help. The house in Beverly Hills became an informal center of hope for parents who, like Dr. Richard, had lost faith in the potential of their different children. And Emily, now a confident girl passionate about learning, became a spokesperson for a greater cause, showing the world that different does not mean defective, it simply means special. 3 months later, during the first graduation of Mrs. Smith's program, Emily took the stage to talk about her experience. "My name is Emily. I'm 10 years old and I'm dyslexic," she said, her clear and proud voice echoing through the packed auditorium. "For a long time, I thought that meant I was dumb, but I discovered it just means my brain is extraordinary in a different way." In the audience, Dr. Richard cried with emotion and pride. Beside him, Mrs. Smith held his hand, her eyes also misty. "Mrs. Smith taught me that there is no right way to learn," Emily continued. "There is the way that works for each of us, and when we find our way, we can achieve any dream." When she finished her speech, the auditorium erupted in applause. In the front row, Lily clapped enthusiastically, proud of her friend who had become her sister at heart. That night, on their way home, the 4 people who now formed a unique family celebrated with a special dinner prepared together. Dr. Richard had learned to cook with Mrs. Smith, Emily mastered the scientific desserts, and Lily brought traditional Florida recipes to the table. "To us," said Dr. Richard, raising a glass of cranberry juice, "a family that chose each other, found each other, and transformed." "To the love that teaches," added Mrs. Smith. "To the differences that make us special," said Emily. "And to the dreams that come true when we believe," concluded Lily. And so, in that house, that was once silent and cold, laughter, discoveries, and the most beautiful sound of all echoed, the sound of people who genuinely care for one another, growing and learning together. What Mrs. Smith taught was not just a way to study, it was a new way to look at humanity. Every child has their own time, language, and special way of seeing the world. And when we find people who truly see us, understand us, and love us as we are, there are no limits to what we can achieve. Emily, who once only received failing grades, was now the standout of the class. But more importantly, she had rediscovered the joy of learning and understood that her difference was not a flaw. It was a gift waiting to be understood and shared with the world. Give us a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and if you watched until here, comment "I watched until here" and share your thoughts on this story. Oh, and don't forget to watch the next video that appears on the final screen. It's going to be very exciting.